Hello everyone. Our today's lesson is the last lesson for master students, and it's the last topic. And here you can see the contents. We have four main contents. The first one is the beginning of the crime fiction as a genre in English literature, and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. But we will talk about Scandal in Bohemia, especially this short story. And the second one, the major themes in the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, the analysis of motifs, characters, and symbols as usual, and also literary elements I added, and the development of detective genre in this period. So I will talk about the fourth topic at the beginning of the lesson, and then I will continue according to second and third topics. So let's get started. Crime fiction. What is crime fiction? Maybe you have some information about it, but I have to give broad information. Crime fiction is a genre of literature that novelizes crimes and criminals. Much of what makes this genre so stimulating is the mental battle that ensues between writer and reader. As the writer reveals clues and works through the crime's mystery, readers try to solve it for themselves before the criminal is revealed at the end of the story. And developed in the 19th century, crime fiction has since become extremely popular, and the genre has had to grow into multiple subgenres. Some of the more common subgenres are whodunit fiction. So the most common form is whodunit fiction. Readers are provided clues that eventually reveal the criminal. And the second one is legal thriller. Characters are usually lawyers and cops. And inverted detective, the criminal is revealed at the beginning and then the story works back to it. And main characteristics of crime fiction. So each subgenre has its distinction. All crime fiction shares basic yet important elements. The first one is significant crime is perhaps the key to any good crime story. The crime is what propels the story forward. It's what motivates the characters and their readers. Therefore, the crime has to be big and worthy. Most importantly, it has to be something that readers will care about. Murder, for this reason, tends to be in crime stories. Other common crimes are stolen objects to high value of kidnapping. Smaller crimes like a stolen car or missing a wallet would not be comparable as significant. And the hero or heroes of the crime story is the protagonist. This is usually the detective or the person trying to solve the crime's mystery. The hero doesn't have to be likable, but does have to be interesting and intelligent enough to figure out clues and move the story along. To keep this hero interesting, there is almost always something unique or different about his or her personality or situation. And the third characteristic is suspicion. The suspects of the crime story are relevant to the story's suspense and intrigue. If the readers know who the criminal is from the first clue, then there is no point in continuing with the story. Therefore, it's up to the writer to introduce multiple suspects or persons of interest. Intentionally misleading clues and suspects are called red herrings. And this helps to keep the reader guessing and actively involved in the crime's mystery. And fourth one, the criminal is essential to any good crime fiction. The criminal has to be well matched against this or her opponent, the story's hero. And therefore, the criminal must be intelligent, sneaky and able to get away with it, and the criminal must be a character in the story introduced early on so as not to trick the reader at the very end with a criminal who was never mentioned. And a realistic or believable story is also necessary to make crime fiction worth reading. If the storyline is awkward, if important details are left out, or if the reader is arguing with the story's facts, then the story has essentially failed. Part of what makes crime fiction so entertaining is that readers like to feel involved in the crime solving. Though it's fictitious, the story should read as authentic and plausible. This keeps the readers focusing on the story rather than dismissing the story. So, and we talked about the main characteristics of crime fiction, and of course we should mention the name of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle because he played main role in crime fiction in English literature. And he was a British writer and medical doctor. He created the character Sherlock Holmes in 1887, sorry. And when he published a study in Scarlet, the first of 4 novels and more than 50 short stories about Holmes and Dr. Watson. The Sherlock Holmes stories are generally considered milestones in the field of crime fiction, and Arthur Conan Doyle was a prolific writer other than Holmes' stories. His works include fantasy and science fiction stories about Professor Challenger and humorous stories about the Napoleonic soldier Gerard, and as well as plays, romance, poetry, nonfiction, and historical novels. And he gave fresh impetus to the emerging form of the detective story by creating Sherlock Holmes. So we will talk about the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. These adventures are containing 12 short stories, and they're published in 14th of October, if I'm not mistaken. Totally, it's published in 1892, and you can see here the names of these 12 stories. And I chose just A Scandal in Bohemia, the first short story, and The Scandal in Bohemia, they have some historical context that you have to know. The Victorian era in England was a time of immense progress and change, especially in terms of crime and punishment. Crime rates were consistently on the rise during the end of the 18th and throughout the 19th century, especially as more people moved into larger cities like London, Oxford, and people of varying social classes lived closer together. The first police force in London was established in 1829, and many of the early bobbies were hardly qualified to investigate crimes, and there was little trust in the institution for decades. In the counties and boroughs, police forces were not set up until the second half of the 19th century. Thanks to the Police Act of 1856, and in the absence of a competent police force, many crimes were investigated by the victims themselves, while those who had the means to pay would contract a private investigator or detective. There were also major advancements in science and technology, and many believe that Sherlock Holmes' deductive method is rooted in the burgeoning faith in science to cure social ills. Finally, this was also a time of rapid growth of the middle class in England, and many readers may have admired that related to the character of Dr. John Watson, a veteran of the Second Afghan War and a member of the new professional class. And what is the major themes of The Scandal in Bohemia? I chose just 4 of them: justice, love, friendship, and admiration, disguise and deception, logics versus emotion. So the first one is justice. In a scandal in Bohemia, as with most of Holmes' adventures, the detective serves a very unconventional form of justice that is not necessarily in line with state-sanctioned law and order. As a private detective, Holmes is deliberately separate from official law enforcement and is able to take on cases that the police could not, and he is also to use methods that aren't available to the police. The story ultimately suggests that justice and the law are not synonymous, and sometimes it requires extra legal measures to solve a tricky case. The case of the King of Bohemia is not one that would commonly be solved by the London Metropolitan Police, which is why the King has come from Prague himself to consult with Holmes directly. And the King emphasizes the importance of secrecy in this case, as exposure would be shameful for the royal family. Despite the fact that Dr. Watson chronicles many of Holmes' adventures, the detective himself is considered more discreet more discreet than the local authorities would be. So, more importantly, he is known for clearing up those mysterious which had been abandoned as hopeless by the official police, according to Watson. So this establishes a hierarchy of investigative work in which Holmes is not only separate from, but also better than the police. This means that he is often employed by the rich and powerful, such as the King of Bohemia and the reigning family of Holland. And in a sense, while most Londoners are at the mercy of the Metropolitan Police, who may or may not have the capacity to bring about justice, Sherlock Holmes' extraordinary detective work is reserved for a privileged few. And the second main theme is, of course, it's love, relationship, and so friendship and admiration. Oh, sorry. Sorry for pausing. So we're talking about themes. Love, friendship, and admiration. The scandal in Bohemia presents a number of intertwined romantic and intellectual pairings. On the one hand, there is an engagement of the King of Bohemia to the Princess of Scandinavia, the marriage of Iron Adler and Godfrey Norton, and a fling between the King and Adler. On the other hand, there is the mutual admiration between both Holmes and Watson, and between Adler and Holmes. So this position of romantic and platonic love establishes a sense of hierarchy in which romantic love, based on passion and emotion, is portrayed as interfere to an intellectual connection. There is a sense of mutual admiration between Sherlock Holmes and Iron Adler that borders on romantic interest, but is based entirely in a meeting of two extraordinary minds. Watson notably chooses to begin his tale by focusing on Holmes' admiration for Adler. Prior to discussing the details of the case itself, he announces to Sherlock Holmes, "She's always the woman." I will explain you this quote in the upcoming slides. So this establishes their relationship as the fundamental building block of this story and as the central character in Holmes' world. Holmes generally has a low opinion of women, deeming them of a lesser intellect, while to modern readers this is certainly an unfair judgment, and it creates the gender issues. Up to this point, Holmes had not come into contact with a woman with mental capacities to match his own. And Adler, however, managed to trick Holmes with a disguise, spy on him to find out his plans, and then foil those plans by leaving England before he can retrieve the king's photos. and he's duly surprised and impressed. While this does not change the way Holmes feels about women in general, it places Adler in a different category altogether. And Holmes' feelings of surprise and admiration for Arne Adler are not unrequited, as Adler is clearly fascinated by the detective as well, and she's equally surprised that Holmes is able to deceive her with his disguises, despite the fact that she had been warned of his extraordinary abilities. Though Adler escapes before Holmes and the king can retrieve the photo they seek, she leaves a letter not addressed to the king, the man she had previously taken as a lover, but to Holmes, recognizing him as a formidable antagonist and seeming to take pleasure in recounting. Sorry for pausing again. We were talking about the relationship, friendship. So there's a sense of mutual admiration between Holmes and Watson that's entirely outside of and superior to any romantic sentiment. And Watson is a true and loyal friend devoted to the documentation of Holmes' detective work out of pure admiration. And it's a pleasure that kept the two men close during the time before Watson's marriage. And despite claiming a satisfying life as a married man, Watson clearly misses Holmes. And when he happens by Baker Street, he's seized with a keen desire to see his friend. Then, when he arrives, he is undeterred by a strange and silent manner, because he is one of the few people who truly understands him. Holmes may not be expressive or emotional, but he has his own ways to expressing his admiration for his friend. Once he and Watson have discussed the upcoming case, and Holmes asks Watson to say nothing that he needs him, and he says, "I'm lost without my Boswell." And so Holmes is at his best when he has an audience, and Watson provides that for him, both through his unflagging admiration and his published chronicles of their adventures together. In contrast to these celebrated intellectual matches, the romantic entanglements in A Scandal in Bohemia are of little consequence and something of a distraction to the main action. The king's relationship with Adler is presented primarily as a problem to be solved. In fact, the king would like to destroy all evidence of their prior affections by destroying the photograph. And he describes himself as having been mad insane at the time, especially considering that as royalty he could not possibly be linked to a commoner, much less as well-known adventurers such as Adler. And there is no hint of romance in the king's planned marriage to a Scandinavian princess either. Sorry for pausing again. And we were talking about themes and friendship and admiration. So Watson's recent marriage is also presented as something of a problem, as it has kept the two friends apart for so long. In addition, Watson references married life once at the beginning of the story, yet once he and Holmes are reunited, he returns to his bachelor lifestyle, spending his free time with Holmes while on a case, and even sleeping at 221B Baker Street instead of at his marital home. In Scandal in Bohemia, despite the fact that Holmes' case involves saving a royal marriage, romance and love have little value to these characters. Despite being in happy marriage to other people, both Watson and Adler establish their most vital connections to Holmes. And while it does not preclude the possibility of these characters finding fulfillment in love in their own personal lives, it's clear that this emotion has no place in their dealings with Holmes. And the other major theme, one of the major themes, is disguise and deception. The other theme is disguise and deception in A Scandal in Bohemia. So, the prolific use of disguises in A Scandal in Bohemia sends the message that not everything is what it seems, and that appearances are never to be trusted. Sherlock Holmes, the King of Bohemia, and Irene Adler all attempt to disguise themselves in order to get what they want, with varied results. The quality of their disguises and their ability to fool those around them is a measure of the intellectual capacity of each character in the story. The King of Bohemia attempts to disguise himself when he comes to meet Holmes, but is unprepared for the detective's powers of observation and detection. When a man arrives wearing a mask and calling himself Count von Kram, Holmes quickly recognizes him for who he is, Wilhelm Gottsreich, and hereditary King of Bohemia. In his demeanor, Holmes makes clear that he is unimpressed by his visitor's royal status as well as his attempts at trickery. The king does not seem to understand the concept of disguise, believing that a flimsy face mask could somehow render him incognito. And despite the opulence of his dress, carriage, and even of the paper he uses to write the note, his inability to hide his true identity is a signal of the king's lack of intellectual and creativity. He is incapable of stepping outside of himself or being anyone other than the King of Bohemia. And Holmes, on the other hand, is a master of disguise and messages to fool everyone around him, including his friend Watson, with his customs. And he begins by transforming into a drunken-looking groom, ill-kempt and side-whiskered, with an inflamed face and disreputable clothes, to glean information about Irene Adler from the neighborhood workmen. His second disguise is that of a clergyman, which he uses to trick Adler into inviting him into her house so that he can find out where she has hidden the much coveted photo of herself with the King of Bohemia. So this is an essential part of his method of detection. The disguise allows him to enter into the world of the crime and observe as much as possible without being recognized. And unlike the king in his ineffectual mask, Holmes embodies the character he is taking on. Watson notes that for Holmes, the disguise was not superficial. And although the goal of this disguise is to fool Adler, she is impressed to learn that she has been tricked by the clergyman costume. In her final message to the detective, she cheers him on, and Holmes' skill with deception then reflects his deductive prose and cunning, as only by closely observing the world can be hoped to imitate it. And Adler's use of disguise, meanwhile, serves a complex dual purpose in the story. On the one hand, she wants to spy on Holmes and learn more about the investigation without being observed herself. At the same time, she wants Holmes to know that she has tricked him, proving that she is too capable of a superior level of cunning. And so another, the last major theme is logic versus emotion. Unlike many Sherlock Holmes adventures, A Scandal in Bohemia does not represent an unsolvable mystery for modern fiction's preeminent detective. Instead, Holmes must trick a young woman, Irene Adler, into divulging the whereabouts of a photograph that could damage the reputation of his latest client, the King of Bohemia. While Holmes is famous for his use of the powers of observation and deductive reasoning to solve crimes, his assistant, John Watson, portrays Holmes as more machine than man. And rejecting emotion in favor of logic and intellect, A Scandal in Bohemia provides a brief glimpse of the detective's human side when he meets the unique and mysterious Adler. When Holmes finds himself bested by Adler, he comes to admire and perhaps feel a certain affection for this woman whose cunning matches his own. The story explores the tension between Holmes' cold and almost inhuman detective abilities and his uncharacteristic response to Mrs. Adler in order to question whether emotion is incompatible with reason. And Watson's description of Holmes at the beginning of the story establishes him not just as an excellent detective, but as superhuman in his intellectual abilities. Watson, who has accompanied Holmes on many cases and observed his methods, describes him as the most perfect reasoning and observing machine that the world has seen, and compares him to a sensitive instrument. When Holmes sees Watson again after months apart, he deduces a number of details of Watson's life that seem incomprehensible to the doctor. Holmes notes, for example, that Watson has employed a clumsy servant girl based on the cuts on the inside of his left shoe. Watson is astounded by Holmes' ability to know so much about him just based on his outward appearance, which leads to a discussion between the two men in which Holmes tells his friend, "You see, but you do not observe." I will explain you this quote later in upcoming slides. And unsurprisingly, the remarkable precision of Holmes' powers of deduction doesn't translate to any sort of similar emotional sensitivity. In fact, Watson portrays Holmes as socially aloof and somewhat marginalized due to his disdain for human emotion or contact. Watson begins his story by noting that he and Holmes had drifted apart prior to its events, largely due to their differing lifestyles. And Watson was beginning to enjoy the comforts of married life, whereas Holmes loved every form of society with his whole Bohemian soul. He makes these comments without judgment, accepting Holmes' isolation as an essential part of his being. And Holmes' social and emotional detachment is further intensified by his drug use. When Watson was not around, the detective would hide away in his apartment, alternating between cocaine and ambition, the drowsiness of the drug, and the fierce energy of his own keen nature. So, and Adler is one of the few characters to elicit anything like emotion from Holmes, and one of the major themes of A Scandal of Bohemia is Watson's surprise at his friend's rare and somewhat contradictory behavior towards her. And it's notable Adler's cunning that catches Holmes' attention, and for him, she eclipses and predominates the whole of her gender. And another thing, Adler herself, however, appears much more emotional than her would-be antagonist, getting married midway through the story and then skipping town with her beloved. For Adler, it seems emotion does not prevent her from outwitting the great Sherlock Holmes, and would in fact suggest that feeling and logic are not as incompatible as they may seem. And so we're talking about the themes, 4 main themes, and you can make some notes about these themes, and you can add your own themes that you discovered in this short story. Of course, I'm open to your own approach. And main characters in Scandal in Bohemia, So the first main character is Sherlock himself. Sherlock is a private detective who has been contracted by Wilhelm von Ormstein, King of Bohemia, to confiscate photographic evidence of the king's previous affair with a woman named Iron Adler. The king has sought out Holmes and his assistant, Dr. John Watson, due to their reputation for solving difficult and delicate cases throughout Europe. And to address the king's issue, Holmes and Watson various disguises, gathering information about Iron's life. Eventually, while disguised as a clergyman, Sherlock tricks Iron into letting him into her home, and he discovers where she's hiding the photographs. So, and Watson's life within the first few seconds of seeing him. Adler, however, is the only woman he would ever consider his intellectual equal, and he seems to think of her wistfully and almost romantically. Sherlock's rare intelligence is a boon to his detective work, but it sets him apart from those around him, and his lack of social connection keeps him almost completely isolated. He's also eccentric and a quite different character from other characters of the short story. And Dr. Watson, a medical doctor and close friend of Sherlock Holmes, Watson narrates A Scandal in Bohemia. He is also a narrator, but he is witness narrator, not the protagonist narrator, because he is a witness to all the incidents around them and Sherlock Holmes. And he also chronicled and published a number of Holmes cases, and clearly admires the detective for his extraordinary powers of observation and deduction. And he used to live with Sherlock, but recently got married and moved in with his wife. He had not seen much of Sherlock since then, and he begins A Scandal in Bohemia by coming to visit his friend, and wherein he is swept up in Sherlock's latest case. And Watson is tolerant of Sherlock's eccentricities because he truly believes in the detective's genius, describing him as the most perfect reasoning and observing machine that the world has seen, as I said before. And the other main character is Iron Adler. Iron Adler is an opera singer, world traveler, and former lover of Wilhelm von Ormstein, King of Bohemia. She has kept letters and photographs that are evidence of her relationship with the king, and according to him, she plans to use them to blackmail him if he tries to marry the Princess of Scandinavia. While Holmes managed to trick Iron with a disguise and gain entry into her house, she catches on quickly and disguises herself to spy on Holmes and Watson, ultimately outwitting them and feeling before they can seize their photographs. Iron is initially portrayed as the story's antagonist, but her intelligence and cunning earn Sherlock Holmes' admiration, and she proves not to be a malicious person at all. In the end, even though she doesn't hand over the photographs, she assures Holmes and the king that she means them no harm. Not only does the King of Bohemia proclaim that she would have made an excellent queen if she were not a commoner, but Sherlock considers her more intelligent than any other woman he has met. And fourth character is Wilhelm Gottfried Sigismund von Ormstein. the Duke of Castle Felstein, and he's the king of Bohemia and Sherlock Holmes' client in this case. He's currently engaged to the Princess of Scandinavia, but reveals to Holmes and Watson that years ago, while in Warsaw, he had a relationship with Iron Adler, an opera singer and well-known adventurers. Iron has a number of letters and photos that would serve as proof of his indiscretion, and that information would likely jeopardize the king's current engagement. And he will do anything to obtain and destroy this evidence, but Iron refuses to hand it over, and she has outsmarted the king's men more than once. And he still admires Iron and notes that she would make an excellent queen, but he is more focused on maintaining his respectability and royal status. The king seems to be unaware of his surroundings and ignorant of his effect on others. When he arrives at Baker Street in a mask, he believes himself to be incognito, despite the fact that Sherlock knows exactly who is he. And the other character is Godfrey Norton, a lawyer who is Iron Adler's new husband. Not much is known about Norton, except that he is a lawyer and he has been seeing Iron for some time. When Sherlock Holmes dresses as a groom and goes to Iron's neighborhood to gather information about her, he is somehow brought into act as a witness to the marriage of Iron and Godfrey. In comparison with the King of Bohemia's wedding, which will presumably be a lavish royal affair, this ceremony is quick and austere, with the new lights driving off in different directions. This quiet ceremony, coupled with the fact that Iron describes Norton as a better man than the king, and present a strong contrast to the public but likely loveless royal marriage. And the other slide is about motifs. We have here 4 motifs. The first one is Holmes' reputation. Many of the cases come about in the first place not by Holmes finding something interesting, but by people coming to him with cases because some acquaintance of theirs has been helped in the past by him. And some of the criminals too recognize whom they are dealing with. And the second motive is interview with the culprit. After deducing the identity of the culprit, Holmes usually invites them without letting them know he knows their culpability to his apartment in order to speak with them. There he reveals his knowledge of what they have done and attempts to exercise a measure of his own justice with them. And the third motive is talent, cleverness and justice. Holmes is a sensible person and at the same time he is talented. The author describes and emphasizes his magnificent intellect. The most stunning feature is that Holmes can always evaluate his clients based on their appearance. He investigates crimes with a wet finger, and it comes naturally to him. The second distinguishing feature of Sherlock is justice. He always tries to solve problems without the police and decides the fate of the wrongdoer himself. And the last motive is travel. The wealth and growth that occurred during Victorian England bequeathed to the nation a far-reaching network of rails and carriage routes. Within cities, residents could hail cabs, carriage taxis, just like people do today. And this created a mobility unknown to earlier generations, a mobility widely reflected the adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Holmes and different characters constantly travel around the city of London and often travel to distant areas of the country. We were talking about last motif, travel, Several of the characters in the stories, such as Neville Clare and Alexander Holder, actually commute into London each day for work by train. And still others, such as Roylott, who lived in India, have traveled overseas. These new opportunities, however, make Holmes' sleuthing more time-consuming, as he must leave his home base in central London to gather clues and investigate. He must also be well informed about the wider world, since many of the cases he works on involve incidents that took place in other countries. In this respect, the mobile, worldly detective is a perfect embodiment of Victorian sleuth. And analysis of symbols. We have three symbols here: disguises, pipes, and violence. So, disguises in a scandal in Bohemia, masks and other forms of disguise represent the power of deceive through cunning and trickery. Nearly all of the characters in this story attempt to disguise themselves with varying degrees of success that in turn is directly linked with their intelligence. For example, as I said before, the brilliant Sherlock Holmes is a master of disguise, and then John Watson, early in the story, when he arrives home to his apartment dressed as a drunken groomsman, and Iron Adler also managed to trick Holmes with her own disguise as a young man who casually greets Holmes and Watson as they discuss their plan to retrieve the photograph, an act that demonstrates her own remarkable cunning. And pipes also is a symbol. Here, Sherlock Holmes' pipes represent his cold logic. He smokes when he is stuck on a case and when he wants to philosophize. The harder the case, the more he smokes. For example, in The Man with the Twisted Lip, in this short story, Holmes stays up smoking the entire night before he is able to connect the dots between Neville St. Clair and the bigger Boone. Over the course of the evening, he winds up smoking a full ounce of coarsely cut tobacco known as shag. And in other stories also. So the pipe, when one is out, the reader knows Holmes' mind is churning. And violence also one of the main symbols in these short stories. Violence represents Sherlock's romantic side. The detective is a master logician who is guided by reason above all else. He is suspect of love and emotions, viewing them as weaknesses that lead to bad decisions and to often crime. As a natural result, he is almost always dispassionate, collected, and unemotional. This state, however, doesn't come entirely naturally to him. In fact, he has to work to repress his emotions. Watson explains, for Holmes actually has a sensitive side he keeps buried. This side comes out with a violin. On rare occasions, Holmes will allow himself the pleasure of playing or listening to violin music, and while he does, he seems to transform into an entirely different person, someone with passion. His head nods along with the music, and he becomes overtaken by the pleasure of the moment, the very vice he rails against when he is in detective mode. And of course, literary elements also necessary to know. So, the genre of the scandal in Bohemia is detective fiction, short story, and the setting is in London, and the time period is Victorian era. And the main climax here, Sherlock Holmes discovers where Iron Adler has hidden her precious photo. And antagonist is Iron Adler, and point of view is third-person limited perspective of John Watson, who chronicles Holmes' adventures. And as usual, you know that we choose some quotes from the original text and try to analyze them. So it's our first quote. So he never spoke of the softer passions, save with a gibe and a sneer. So it's from by Dr. Watson. in Scandal in Bohemia. Here, Dr. John Watson describes Sherlock Holmes, explaining that because Holmes is such a creature of reason, he looks down on emotions and feelings, seeing them as shortcomings of the unreasonable or immature. And the second quote is by Sherlock Holmes. I have no data yet. It's a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. So Sherlock Holmes refuses to hypothesize about the crime until he has a strong base of good facts. To speculate without knowing the facts is a surefire way to fail. He repeats his belief in good data in many of the stories in the book. And the third one is by Holmes again. You see, but you do not observe. Here Holmes explains more of how he comes to his deductions. He is not just passively seeing things. Instead, he is actively examining and observing his surroundings. This helps him gather evidence to deduce conclusions from. And the fourth one is by Watson. So to Sherlock Holmes, she's always the woman. I have seldom heard him mention her under any other name. So this quote is about Irene Adler. Irene Adler is arguably the most famous female character from any of Doyle's works, even though she only appeared in one story, A Scandal in Bohemia. She's one of a few people who has outwitted Holmes, and for this she has earned his complete admiration. She's referenced in other stories, including His Last Bow and The Five Orange Pips. So, this is the end of the presentation, and I hope you enjoyed. And for home task, I would give you, I have sent you the short story of A Scandal in Bohemia, and it's I hope you enjoyed to read this short story, and I think after watching this video it would be so clear to you some aspects of the short story, and try to analyze by your own approach. Of course, it's the main thing that I want every lesson, and just prepare all your topics, all your contents, and prepare to the next revision and seminars, and of course to your exam. And try to look at all the slides that I wrote, and try to listen carefully what I say. Try to make notes of themes, symbols, motifs, characters, and etc. So see you next time, and thanks for watching. Take care of yourself. Bye bye.